You think Floki was a genius? The mad shipbuilder? The devoted servant of the gods, the man who danced on beaches, whispered to timber, and saw visions that no one else could see. The TV show turned him into something almost supernatural, a prophet wrapped in wood shavings and pagan ecstasy. Millions fell in love with him. He was strange, he was brilliant, he was untouchable, but the real Floki, he wasn't a shipbuilder, he wasn't a mystic, and the gods he believed in didn't save him from the worst mistake of his life. Because the real man behind that name, Hrafna-Flóki Vilgerðarson, was an explorer who became so obsessed with finding a new land that he ignored every warning, every sign, and every piece of practical wisdom that could have saved the people who trusted him. He sailed into the unknown, found what he was looking for, and then watched it destroy everything he had brought with him. Today you'll discover 3 things the show never told you. First, the bizarre and brutal navigation method Floki used to find Iceland, involving 3 ravens and a terrifying gamble on the open Atlantic. Second, the catastrophic winter that killed his livestock, starved his settlers, and turned his dream of a new world into a frozen nightmare. And third, how Floki returned to Norway a broken man, and publicly declared that the land he had discovered was worthless, a wasteland not fit for human life. The TV show gave you a visionary who found paradise. The real story is about a man who found hell and called it ice. Picture the North Atlantic in the 9th century, not the calm blue ocean of maps and imagination, and a churning gray void where storms could appear in minutes and swallow a ship without leaving a trace, where the horizon stretched in every direction with nothing, no land, no markers, no certainty that anything existed beyond the next wave. This was the world Floki chose to sail into, not because he was ordered to, not because he was running from enemies, but because something inside him, call it faith, call it madness, call it the same thing, told him there was land to the west. He had heard the rumors, every sailor in Norway had, whispers of a man named Nadad who had been blown off course and glimpsed a distant shore covered in snow. Whispers of another man, Gardar Svavarsson, who had actually circumnavigated a massive island to the northwest and confirmed it existed. But whispers and confirmation are very different things, especially when you're standing on a dock in Norway, looking west into nothing and deciding to bet your life on a rumor. Floki didn't hesitate, and that's where the trouble began. His real name was Hrafna-Flóki, Raven-Floki, and that name wasn't poetic. It was earned. We know almost nothing about his childhood. The sagas don't give us parents, mentors, or formative traumas. What they give us is a man already formed, already obsessed, already looking west when everyone else was looking east toward the raiding routes of England and Francia. While other Norse warriors measured their worth in silver and blood, Floki measured his in distance. How far could a ship go? How far could a man push into the unknown before the world simply ended? That obsession made him different, and different in 9th century Scandinavia was dangerous. But here's what set Floki apart from every other dreamer who stared at the ocean and imagined what might be on the other side. He didn't just dream, he engineered. The problem with sailing west from Norway was navigation. There were no compasses, no charts, no reliable way to know if you were heading toward land or sailing in circles until your water ran out and your crew died of thirst. The sun helped during the day, if it was visible, which in the North Atlantic, it often wasn't. The stars helped at night, if the clouds broke, which they rarely did. Every voyage into unknown waters was essentially a guess wrapped in prayer. Floki refused to guess, and his solution was as brilliant as it was brutal. He brought 3 ravens, not as pets, not as symbols of Odin, despite what the show might have you believe, as tools, living, breathing navigation instruments. The method was simple and ruthless. When Floki suspected land might be near, he released the first raven. The bird flew up, circled the ship, saw nothing but ocean in every direction, and returned to the mast. No land ahead. They sailed on. Days passed, gray water in every direction. The crew growing quieter. The food supply shrinking, the doubt building like pressure in a sealed room. Then Floki released the second raven. It flew up, circled, hesitated, and returned to the ship. Still nothing. But the hesitation mattered. Something had changed in the bird's behavior. Maybe it sensed a shift in the wind. Maybe it caught a scent of earth that human noses couldn't detect. Floki watched that raven return to the mast and made a decision that most captains would have considered insane. He kept sailing west. Was it observation or obsession? Was he reading the raven or reading his own desperate need to be right? The answer didn't matter yet. It would matter later. It would matter enormously. Days later, maybe a week, the sagas don't specify, Floki released the third raven. The bird flew up from the deck, circled once, twice, and then broke formation. It flew northwest, away from the ship, away from the safety of the mast. It didn't circle back. It didn't hesitate. It had seen something. Floki turned the ship and followed the raven. His entire crew, their lives, their families, their livestock, everything they owned, now chasing a bird across the open Atlantic. And this is the moment the TV show would have scored with triumphant music and wide-eyed wonder. The visionary proved right, the genius vindicated. But the real story? The real story was just beginning its descent into disaster. Because what Floki found when he followed that raven wasn't paradise. It was a trap dressed in beauty. The first sight of land must have felt like vindication from the gods themselves. After weeks on the open Atlantic, weeks of gray waves, dwindling food, and a crew held together by nothing but Floki's certainty, a coastline emerged from the mist. Mountains, glaciers catching the pale Arctic light, green valleys tucked between walls of black volcanic rock, waterfalls crashing down cliffs into fjords so deep they looked like wounds in the earth. It was stunning, and Floki knew it immediately. This was no barren rock. This was a land that could sustain life, a land worth claiming. But here's what the sagas tell us that the TV show conveniently forgot. Floki wasn't alone in this discovery. He wasn't even first. Nadad had glimpsed this land before him and called it Snæland, Snowland. Gardar Svavarsson had actually sailed around the entire island and spent a winter there. Floki was the third Norseman to reach these shores, not the pioneer, the follower. So, why does history remember Floki and not the others? Because Floki did something neither of them had the courage or the recklessness to attempt. He didn't just visit, he tried to stay. He sailed along the southern coast, rounded the western edge, and found a fjord that seemed perfect. Breidafjörður, a wide, sheltered inlet on the northwestern coast. The waters were teeming with fish. Seals crowded the rocks. Seabirds filled the sky in numbers that must have seemed impossible after weeks of ocean emptiness. And this place looked like a gift, and this is where Floki made his first critical mistake. The mistake that would cost him everything. He was so overwhelmed by the abundance, so drunk on the validation of his own vision, that he stopped thinking like a settler and started thinking like a conqueror. The fish were endless. The seals were easy to hunt. The fjord was protected. Why worry about the future when the present was this generous? His crew began fishing and hunting immediately. Day after day, they pulled in enormous catches. The seals provided meat and fat. The waters gave them more than they could consume. It felt like the land itself was welcoming them. But Floki forgot something fundamental. Something that any experienced Norse farmer would have screamed at him about if they had been standing on that shore. He forgot about winter. In Norway, every farmer knew the rhythm. Summer was for growing, harvesting, and preparing hay. Enormous quantities of dried grass to feed livestock through the frozen months when nothing grew. It was backbreaking, unglamorous, essential work. Miss the hay season, and your animals die. Your animals die, and you die. It was that simple. Every child in Scandinavia knew this. Floki knew it too, but the fish blinded him. Why cut hay when the ocean keeps giving? Why spend weeks in the fields drying grass when you can pull food directly from the water every single day? The logic felt sound in the endless daylight of an Icelandic summer, when the sun barely dipped below the horizon and everything felt permanent. But nothing in Iceland is permanent, and the summer that felt like it would never end was already dying. The first warning came with the wind, a shift from the southwest to the north. Subtle at first, then sharper. The days began to shorten, not gradually like in Norway, but rapidly, as if someone were drawing a curtain across the sky. The temperature dropped. The fish began to disappear from the fjord, retreating to deeper waters. The seals moved on, and Floki looked at his fields, empty, uncut, useless, and for the first time since leaving Norway, felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: doubt. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford, because the winter that was coming for Breidafjörður wasn't a Norwegian winter. It wasn't cold rain and short days and discomfort. It was something his crew had never experienced, something no amount of fish could prepare them for. And by the time Floki understood what was actually happening, it was far too late to do anything but survive it. The Icelandic winter arrived like a door slamming shut on the world. It didn't creep in, it descended. 1 week, the fjord was open water. The next, ice. Not the thin, crackable ice of a Norwegian harbor. Thick, grinding, relentless ice that sealed Breidafjörður like a tomb. The fishing boats that had been Floki's lifeline became useless wooden shells frozen into the surface. The nets that had pulled in endless catches now hung stiff and brittle in the frozen air. And the darkness. The Icelandic winter darkness was something none of them were prepared for. In northwestern Iceland, at Floki's latitude, the sun barely rises during the deepest months of winter. What passes for daylight is a gray smear on the southern horizon that lasts a few hours before the blackness returns. Not night as they knew it in Norway. Something heavier. Something that pressed down on the mind like a physical weight. But the darkness wasn't what killed them. The hay was. Or rather, the absence of hay. Floki's livestock, the cattle and sheep he had brought across the Atlantic to start a new life, began to starve. There was nothing to feed them. The grass was buried under feet of snow and ice. The stores that should have been filled with dried hay were empty because Floki had spent the summer fishing instead of farming. One by one, the animals began to die. Picture it. You're standing in a frozen settlement at the edge of the known world. The ocean that brought you here is sealed shut. The sun has abandoned you. And every morning you walk outside to find another animal dead, frozen, starved, collapsed in the snow. The sound of a dying cow in the Arctic cold is something you don't forget. A low, grinding moan that seems to come from the earth itself. Floki heard that sound every day. And every dead animal was a message he couldn't ignore. You did this. Your arrogance, your obsession, your refusal to do the unglamorous work that would have kept them alive. But the livestock wasn't the worst of it. His crew began to turn. Not violently, not yet, but the loyalty that had carried them across the Atlantic was evaporating faster than their food supplies. These were men who had followed Floki because he promised them a new world, a better life, land and abundance and freedom from the overcrowded fjords of Norway. Now they were trapped in a frozen wasteland watching their animals die, and the man who had led them here had no solution. What do you say to men who trusted you with their lives and now watch their futures dying in the snow? Floki said nothing. The sagas don't record speeches or apologies or plans. They record silence. And in that silence, something broke inside the man who had been so certain that the gods were guiding him. Then it got worse. The Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, one of the most important historical records of the Norse colonization, tells us that during this catastrophic winter, someone in Floki's expedition died. The sources are sparse on details. Some scholars believe it was a member of his crew. Others suggest it may have been someone closer, a daughter, according to some interpretations. Now, we don't know for certain, but what we know is this. Death visited Floki's camp that winter, and it wasn't just the animals paying the price for his miscalculation. Spring finally came, but it didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and clarity was worse. Floki climbed a mountain above Breidafjörður. The sagas are specific about this. He climbed to a high point and looked north across the landscape, and what he saw finished him. A fjord still choked with drift ice. Not melting, not retreating, just sitting there, massive, white, and permanent, blocking any hope of sailing home or receiving supplies. Ice in every direction, as far as his eyes could reach, and it was in that moment, standing on that mountain, looking at the frozen ruins of his dream, that Floki gave this land its name. Not Snaeland, as Nadot had called it. Not something hopeful or neutral. Island, Iceland. He named it after his failure, after the ice that had killed his livestock, trapped his ships, and destroyed everything he had tried to build. The word wasn't a description, it was a verdict, a condemnation spoken from a mountaintop by a man who had come looking for paradise and found a graveyard. The TV show turned this moment into something mystical. Floki discovering a sacred land. Floki communing with the gods. Floki finding his destiny. The real moment was the opposite. It was a man standing alone above the wreckage of his ambition, naming the thing that had beaten him. When the ice finally retreated enough to allow passage, Floki gathered what was left of his expedition, the surviving crew, the handful of remaining animals, the shattered morale, and sailed back to Norway. The voyage home was brutal. Storms separated the ships. Some of the crew may not have made it. The details are thin because the sagas don't waste words on retreats. But what happened when Floki reached Norway? That's where the story delivers its final blow. Floki came home to questions. Every sailor on the Norwegian coast wanted to know, what did you find? What's out there? Is the land real? Can we live there? And Floki's answer stunned them all. He told everyone who would listen that Iceland was worthless, a frozen wasteland, a death trap disguised as an island. He spoke of the ice that choked the fjords, the winters that killed livestock, the darkness that crushed the human spirit. He told them not to go. He told them there was nothing there worth risking a life for. The man who had sailed west with absolute faith returned east with absolute bitterness. But here's where the story fractures and where the real Floki becomes something more complicated than either a genius or a failure. Because not everyone on that expedition agreed with him. A man named Thorolf, one of Floki's own crew members, told a completely different story. Thorolf said the land was rich. He said butter dripped from every blade of grass. He painted Iceland as a paradise of abundance and possibility. His enthusiasm was so extreme that people gave him a nickname, Thorolf Butter, because his descriptions were so exaggerated they sounded like he was spreading it thick. 2 men, same voyage, same winter, same dead livestock, same frozen fjord, and they came home telling opposite stories. Was Floki telling the truth? Was Thorolf? The answer is probably somewhere in between. Iceland was harsh and dangerous, but not hopeless. Not if you prepared properly. Not if you cut the hay. Not if you respected the land instead of assuming it would bend to your will. But Floki couldn't see that. His failure had poisoned his vision so completely that he could only see ice where others saw potential. The land hadn't failed him, he had failed the land. And he couldn't live with that truth. So he rewrote it. Iceland wasn't his mistake. Iceland was simply a terrible place. That was easier to carry home, and yet, and this is the part that makes the story unforgettable, Floki went back. The sagas tell us that years later, after other settlers had proved that Iceland could sustain life if approached with proper preparation, Floki returned to the island he had condemned. He settled there, he lived there, he spent the rest of his days on the land he had once called a wasteland. Why? What changed? Did he realize he had been wrong? Did the failure haunt him so deeply that he needed to prove to himself, to the dead livestock, to the crew members who had cursed his name, that he could do it right the second time? The sagas don't say, they just tell us he went back, and that silence is louder than any explanation. The TV show gave you a Floki who was a vessel of the gods, a visionary who built perfect ships and discovered sacred lands and danced on the edge of madness, like it was a gift. He was magnetic. He was lovable. He was everything a fictional character should be. The real Floki was none of those things. Or he was a navigator who used ravens instead of faith, an explorer who found exactly what he was looking for and then destroyed it through arrogance, a man who named an entire country after his own failure, and then, quietly, stubbornly, without explanation, went back to try again. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't a mystic. He was something more human and more painful than either. He was a man who was wrong, and who spent the rest of his life living inside the proof of it. The mad shipbuilder the TV show created never existed. But the real Floki, Hrafna-Flóki, Raven-Floki, the man who followed birds into the unknown and paid for it with everything, left a mark on history that no TV show could invent. Because he named a country, and that country still carries the scar of his disappointment in its name, 1,000 years later. Every time you say the word Iceland, you're repeating the verdict of a man standing on a frozen mountain, staring at the death of his dream. If you want to discover more real stories behind the legends they fed you, subscribe now. The truth is always darker than the show.